Howdy, gang. Now that I got the Steve Miller stick in my craw taken care of, we'll get on to what I was going to talk about, which is origins or bust. And I was reminded of it at our Inland Northwest Free Thought Society meeting, where this question was actually discussed by some of the people here. Um, the origins or bust trope is what I describe as that phenomenon where anti-evolutionists want to jump, hop, skippity jump, to how did life originated or how did the universe originated. And when you start analyzing that, it turns out that's how they avoid thinking about all the stuff that happens after the origin of life. And they often very, very vague about what they think that involves. We're dealing with a problem with their absence of a map of time in their heads. Now, there's all sorts of ways that you can start putting things into perspective, and you can use a physical venue, but if you've got anything that is an object or a space, you can do like what I'm doing here with a, whoops, there we go, a standard measure. Let's imagine this is the entire history of the Earth. I did the same trick with a portable map of time PDF that you can find at my website, www.tortucan.wordpress.com, where I put the entire history of the universe onto a single sheet, including everything to scale, which is not easy to do if you use the calendar approach or the spiral approach or the clock approach, which is the way these things tend to be. So I have a series of nested charts, and it's a free PDF. Everybody can download it. Anyway, you can do much the same thing on a general scale approach, which is, let's imagine that, boy, it's hard to get this little thing into place. It wants to wobble inside of the image screen here. Let's imagine that this side here is now, and this side over here is the origin of life. Boy, that just really doesn't want to stay standard in the frame. I'm absolutely amazed at this. So I'm actually holding this weird thing at an odd angle, which is not what I was expecting it to do. If you imagine that all of life here is everything that exists currently, and way over here you've got the origin of life. That's roughly 4 billion years along this chart here, which means 2 billion years is about here, which puts cyanobacteria kind of around here, and then yeah, right around in there. And then you have to scale all the way down here to start getting into the Cambrian explosion and more complex Ediacara fauna, or less complex Ediacara fauna, and that are occurring before that time. So you can see there's a huge amount of space that is occurring way long after you have the origin of life stuff clear down here. So if you ask the average anti-evolutionist, doesn't matter whether they're young earth creationist or intelligent designer, they don't really have a clear notion of what it was that was being originating. If they think it was 6,000 years old or 3.8 billion, they may not really be clear that it's just bacteria. There's no lions and tigers, oh my. There's no dinosaurs. There's no complex vertebrates or anything. That's way, 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 way later. And we have a track record on this. In the last, certainly 50 years, we've been able to identify in the paleontological record the little trace elements and trace fossils of little bacterial forms. They're not easy to find, but they're findable. And depending upon what kind of organism they are, they're also showing even the ones that aren't necessarily directly preserved, because bacteria have this ability to be selective about what isotopes they use. And so there's a whole mess and elements. So you can look at trace elements and proportions that you can use inferentially to figure out what was alive then. And one thing you discover is there's just bacteria for like 1 billion years. That's a really, 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 really long time. And if there was a designer there, it certainly wasn't in any bloody hurry even to get to cyanobacteria, which are the ones that produce oxygen as a byproduct and rusted out the oceans and eventually become the chloroplasts endosymbiotically connected up into plants. And it's a lot of story down the road. So your anti-evolutionist isn't going to want to know about most of that stuff. They won't have read about it in their apologetics they're reading, because they don't discuss it either. And they don't have a clear map of time in their heads. So anyone trying to jump into an origins or bust argument is going to be on a slippery slope, because they're just going to want to dig in their heels and want to know how life originated. From my standpoint, looking at the paleontological record, the reptile-mammal transition, origin of birds out of dinosaurs and all that, we got a ton of physical evidence and not one bit of it changes depending upon how life originated. Life could have been the biggest miracle of all get out 3.8 billion years ago. It doesn't change what we're seeing with organisms that already have homeobox genes. They're already sexually reproducing. They're laying amniotic eggs at the time of the synapsid split into the reptile-mammal transition, which is taking place about 250 million years ago. So if you have to enter into a where did life come from argument, you need to probe a bit to realize just how little the person you're talking to may know about all that other baggage, and they're just going to want to home in on the origin stuff. The short answer is we don't know yet how life originated. The longer answer is we know quite a bit more about the pieces than we did 15 to 20 years ago. And a lot of that information also, the typical anti-evolutionist will be absolutely clueless on, and even a lot of people on the evolution side aren't necessarily up on it. So I'll try to give you a crash course here in the cutting edge work. DNA is translated into RNA, which is then run through a little ribosome where the amino acid codons amino acids are assigned and plugged together to make proteins based on the coding in the DNA that they've gotten a translation in the RNA. Now, it's an interesting bit that it doesn't use a DNA version of DNA. It uses a different format, that RNA stuff, which replaces the tyrosine nucleotide with uracil. And it's not entirely obvious why it needs to do that, why you couldn't have a genetic system that simply makes a DNA template and runs the DNA through rather than an RNA template. And so in the last 20 or 30 years, it's becoming increasingly the implication that RNA is there because that was part of the earlier system that was running in earlier life before DNA took over as the coding system. That RNA has some peculiar properties, it turns out, that DNA doesn't. DNA is really stable. It can be zipped and unzipped and held together much easier than RNA can when you try to think about how you can make the counterpart. It twists differently also than RNA. And so there's a logical reason why DNA ended up as the information storage part. But RNA has some things that DNA doesn't do. And only recently has it been found that little strips of RNA can copy themselves. They're autocatalytic. They can make little copies of themselves that make themselves bigger copies of themselves. And you can make pretty long stretches, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 nucleotide sequences with RNA without anything, no biological system required to do that. And these little critters are now called ribozymes. Now, one of the things that only was discovered about the year 2000, and it certainly got into the news, but the anti-evolutionists don't pay a heck of a lot of attention to it, is that ribosome I mentioned, the thing that you run the RNA through to read the code and plug together to make the amino acids to make the proteins, or to pull the amino acid in to assemble to make the proteins. It turns out that the core system, the molecule that actually does the reading part and plugging part, is an RNA ribozyme. It's not a protein. And this came as kind of a shock to everybody. A molecule that seems to be all protein has at its core one of those little autocatalytic RNA gizmos. So it's increasingly looking like there was, before the DNA system clicked in as the default, with RNA as a hitchhiker, that it may have been the other way around, that RNA was the coding system and DNA became the hitchhiker that eventually took over, in the same way that mitochondria become subordinate components inside of our cells because of an endosymbiotic process. We don't even know for sure that the RNA system was the very first. But there is an increasing amount of work. John Sutherland has been doing quite a lot of this work on hydrothermal vents and how the components of an RNA molecular system are being generated pretty much automatically, especially when you add in a broader rich, like including phosphorus, for example. Suddenly some prebiotic reactions that were thought to be extremely difficult to generate abiotically just go boop, automatic, when you add in the right elements. That work also tends to get downplayed in the anti-evolution literature. Another factor involves why the codons are associated the way they are. There are 3 codons in a DNA, so it can be an A, T, C, or G, as to which it is, and triplets of those code for the amino acids. And there has been a lot of thinking recently to think that that may not have always been the case, that there may have been fewer amino acids and fewer codons in the original system, only 2 instead of 3, because the third one has a lot of redundancy in it. If you look, the codons don't encode for 64 amino acids, they only code for 20, and so a whole chunk of them have duplications. And if you look at the one with the redundant third codon, they're the ones that are the most commonly used, and they're the easiest to synthesize prebiotically. So if you pare it down to a 20 amino acid system, or fewer amino acids encoded only by duplexes instead of codecs, so you don't have all the 20, that may be a clue as to the components of the earlier life that was preceding the stuff that eventually got to be the more complex system that we see today. Now, do we have all the answers to all this stuff? Nah, it's still an ongoing work. But there's an awful lot of things in science that are like that. To this day, we do not know how lightning is formed in a thundercloud. Surprise! We know it's electrical. We've known that since Ben Frank day. But how exactly does a cloud segregate enough electric charge to make that zot that hits people on golf courses? And the answer is we don't know how that works. Now, even supercomputers start going frazzle when they try to model it, even though you're only talking about water vapor and some dust particles, but it's just too complex. And if we're thinking about that argument that, well, if you can't explain something at a mechanistic level, it must be design, then are we going to allow the Thor or Zeus hypothesis for lightning formation to be included in the schools? Because after all, we don't actually know how lightning is formed in a thundercloud. A similar situation occurred with the development of flight, the notorious bumblebee example. That technically for many years there were some grumpy mathematicians who looked at the aerodynamics of a bumblebee and said its wings are too small to fly, and yet they buzz around. So the simple solution is we're missing something. And it wasn't until just like about 10 or 15 years ago that they finally started to do detailed wind tunneling and computer modeling that they realized that the little bumblebee's wings aren't fixed. They wobble and oscillate. And what they end up doing is creating vortexes on top of their little oscillating wings that produce low pressure zones that increases the functional lift of the bumblebee, hence the reason why it can fly. The same thing occurred with the discovery of flight. Up until the Wright brothers, those bicycle mechanics, figured the thing out, a great many very great scientific minds were certain you couldn't do heavier than air flight. And in fact, Simon Newcomb, the mathematician, put out a calculation that it would be impossible to build a heavier than air flying machine that could carry something bigger than a cockroach. He did this calculation in 1906 at about the same time that the Wright brothers were already flying around in public, but this wasn't as commonly known until then. It's one of the great oops mathematical calculations in history. But the point is that once it was figured out how to do that, then everyone goes, duh, and now people can make easy hang gliders and all sorts of things that they can fly long distances, and they can figure out how to use very, very lightweight engines to fly all sorts of stuff. That somehow eluded Leonardo da Vinci and Simon Newcomb and all these other people before. So the idea that because a scientific discipline can't figure something that's really hard out until suddenly some guy gets the right connection. And one of the reasons why the Wright brothers were able to do what they did is because they took an additional element. They realized they needed to deal with how you controlled the plane once you were in the air. And that wing warping thing they came up with was able to do something that the completely fixed wing surfaces on the Simon Newcomb's Flyer, for example, which was powered by a heavy steam engine, couldn't quite do. I think Origin of Life is in the same boat. Although, if it turns out that in order to be able to replicate life in a vat, you have to make an experiment that's the size of Connecticut and have to stir it for 100,000 years, even though it's purely mechanistic, that's not an easy thing to do or get a grant for. Although I suspect that once more of the pieces are connected up, they'll be able to basically jumpstart the process and figure out and trace things in the lab that way. And in that case, anti-evolutionists will have to face the problem that Louis Pasteur warned about in 1904. He wasn't an anti-evolutionist, he wasn't an evolutionist per se, he just didn't bother too much about the subject. But at one point, he made a lecture where he was saying, you know, if you're going to be harping on this biogenesis issue and arguing that until you can make life in a lab, this is how the proof of God comes about, what happens if they crack it? And suddenly they've got life in the lab. Does that mean you become an atheist? And the obsession with origins or bust as a way of avoiding thinking about all the evidence for natural branching speciation that doesn't depend on how life originated is one of the reasons why the origins or bust argument is not a great one to get yourself bogged down into, but you need to be aware of where the cutting edge science is on this subject, and also to be able to explain why, sorry, this doesn't make the reptile-mammal transition go away. Thank you for listening to this little spiel on the matter of the origin of life and the puzzles therein.